Speaking only to myself, I never knew the alien woman was listening. She smiled softly. Lieutenant Jake Morrison sat alone in the observation deck of the research station orbiting Kepler 442b and stared at the purple nebula stretching across the viewport like spilled paint on black canvas, and he thought he was completely alone in the dim lighting of the room, where only the soft hum of life support systems kept him company. He had been stationed here for 8 months now, and the isolation was beginning to wear on him in ways he had not expected, and tonight he felt particularly heavy, with thoughts he would never dare share with his crew, because they looked up to him as their commander, and he could not show weakness. So he did what he always did when the weight became too much, and he spoke quietly to himself as if having a conversation with an old friend back on Earth. I do not know if I am strong enough for this anymore, and every day feels longer than the last, and sometimes I wonder if anyone back home even remembers we are out here. And he paused and ran his hand through his dark hair and continued speaking into the empty room. My sister used to tell me I was brave, but I do not feel brave right now, and I feel small and tired and maybe a little bit broken. What he did not know was that he was not alone. Standing in the shadowed corner near the doorway was Lyria, and she was one of the Velian ambassadors assigned to the joint human and alien research mission, and her species was tall and elegant, with skin that shimmered like pearl under moonlight, and eyes that held depths of violet and silver. She had entered the observation deck minutes earlier, seeking the same solace he had, and when she heard his voice, she had frozen and debated whether to announce her presence or leave quietly. But something in his words held her in place. Velians were telepathic to some degree, and could sense emotions like humans sense temperature, and what she felt radiating from this human male was not weakness as he seemed to fear, but rather a profound strength wrapped in vulnerability. Her people had studied humans for 3 years since first contact, and they found them fascinating and confusing in equal measure, because humans were warriors and poets and dreamers all at once, and they carried contradictions within themselves that made them unpredictable. Lyria had been warned by her superiors that humans were dangerous, and that they should never be underestimated, because despite their short lifespans and fragile bodies, they had conquered their own world and reached for the stars with determination that bordered on recklessness. But as she listened to Jake speak to himself in the darkness, she realized that the reports had missed something essential about humans. They were not dangerous because they were fearless, but because they acted, despite their fear. Jake continued speaking, and his voice grew softer and more raw with each word. I miss coffee that actually tastes good, and I miss rain, and I miss my niece Katie, who is probably 10 years old by now, and I missed her birthday again, and he laughed bitterly and shook his head. What kind of uncle does that? And what kind of man chooses the stars over the people he loves? Lyria felt something shift in her chest, and it was an emotion her people rarely experienced, because Velians lived for centuries and formed fewer attachments. And yet this human with his short, precious life was pouring his heart out to an empty room because he had no one else. She stepped forward, and the soft sound of her footsteps made him spin around, and his hand instinctively went to the utility tool at his belt, before he recognized her ambassador Lyria, and he straightened immediately, and his face flushing with embarrassment. And I did not realize anyone else was here, and I apologize if I disturbed you. She raised one slender hand and tilted her head in the Velian gesture of peace, and her long silver hair cascaded over her shoulder like liquid metal. You did not disturb me, Lieutenant Morrison, and she moved closer, and her movements graceful and unhurried, and I should apologize for listening without announcing my presence. Jake cleared his throat and tried to compose himself, but the damage was done, and she had heard everything, and he felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. How much did you hear? And he asked quietly. Enough. And she replied. And then she did something that surprised him. She smiled. It was a soft expression and gentle and understanding, and it transformed her alien features into something that felt almost human in its warmth. Your words were honest, Lieutenant, and honesty is the rarest form of courage. He blinked at her and uncertain how to respond. And in his experience, most people either dismissed vulnerability as weakness or became uncomfortable and changed the subject. But Lyria did neither. Instead, she moved to stand beside him at the viewport and gazed out at the nebula with him. "On my world, we have a saying." And she said after a moment, "And the strongest trees are not those that never bend in the wind, but those that bend and do not break." Jake looked at her profile and studied, the way starlight reflected in her violet eyes. "Your people see vulnerability as strength." And he asked skeptically. She turned to face him fully, and her expression serious. "My people live for 800 years, Lieutenant, and we have seen empires rise and fall, and we have watched species destroy themselves and save themselves, and do you know what separates those who survive from those who do not?" He shook his head. "Those who survive are the ones who admit when they are struggling and who ask for help and who speak their truth even when it is difficult." And she paused. "And your species is young, Lieutenant Morrison, and you live such brief, intense lives, and yet you reach further than races twice your age. But that is not because you are fearless, and it is because you act despite your fear and because you love, despite knowing you will lose what you love and because you hope, despite having every reason to despair." Jake felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "You really believe that I know it?" And she said simply, "And I have studied your species for 3 years, and I have read your literature and watched your films and listened to your music. And you humans have a phrase that captures what makes you extraordinary." She paused and seemed to search for the right words. "You say that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in the face of it. And my people forgot that truth long ago, and we became cautious, and we stopped taking risks, and we stopped truly living, but humans." And she smiled again in that soft, gentle expression, "And humans burn bright and brief like supernovas, and you light up the darkness around you." For a long moment Jake could not speak, and something about her words had reached past his defenses and touched something deep inside him that he had kept carefully locked away. "Thank you," and he finally managed, and his voice rough with emotion. Lyria inclined her head, and then she reached out and placed her hand over his, where it rested on the railing. Her skin was warm and smooth, and there was a faint electric tingle where they touched. "You miss your niece, Katie," and she said quietly, "and tell me about her." And so he did. He talked about Katie, and about his sister back on Earth, and about his childhood, and about all the small precious things he had left behind to come to the stars. And Lyria listened. She listened the way only someone who truly understands loneliness can listen, and with complete attention and without judgment. As he spoke, Jake realized that this moment had become something unexpected and something important. He had come to the observation deck to be alone with his doubts, and instead, he had found connection. And Lyria, who had spent 3 years studying humans from a distance, had finally understood what her reports and research could never capture. She had understood that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their determination. It was their ability to be vulnerable and to share their pain, and to find strength in admitting weakness. When Jake finally finished talking, the observation deck had grown darker as the station rotated away from the nearest star. But somehow the darkness felt less heavy now. "I should let you get some rest, Ambassador." And Jake said, though he found himself reluctant to leave. Lyria nodded but did not release his hand. "Tomorrow we have the joint research meeting." And she said, "And perhaps afterward you would join me for what you call coffee. And I believe I have acquired some real beans from Earth through the supply." Ship Jake laughed, and the sound genuine and surprised. "I would like that very much." As he turned to leave, she called out to him, "Lieutenant Morrison." He looked back. "You are stronger than you know," and she said, And your niece Katie is lucky to have an uncle who loves her enough to reach for the stars." Jake smiled and nodded and left the observation deck with a lighter heart than he had carried in months. And Lyria stood alone in the darkness and watched the nebula paint the viewport in shades of purple and blue. She had come seeking solitude, and instead she had discovered something her people had lost long ago. She had discovered what it meant to truly connect with another soul, and she realized that perhaps humans had been teaching the galaxy lessons all along. Lessons about courage and about vulnerability and about the strength it takes to admit you are afraid. Speaking only to himself, he had not known she was listening, but she had smiled softly, and in that smile was the beginning of understanding between two species and two souls, and two lonely hearts reaching across the vast darkness of space to find each other.